In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this really cute and easy fish quilt block that is part of the free quilt pattern for my Wake at the Lake fabric collection from Riley Blake Designs. I made the fish that is part of the free quilt, and then I just put borders around it to turn it into an 8.5-inch square. So you can turn these fish into the quilt block of whatever size you want. You could put it higher, you could put it lower, just depending on how wide you did your border fabrics. But I just wanted to show you an example before we get started on the fish block together. For each fish, you're going to need 2 pieces from the navy fish pattern, 4 inches by 5 3/4 and 4 inches by 2 1/4. Then you will need 4 herringbone squares that are each 2 1/4-inch square, and then 2 herringbone squares that are 1.5 inches. Now this block is easy because it uses what is called a stitch and flip method. Basically, we are going to put these squares right sides together. We're going to line it up in the corner. We're going to draw a line and we will stitch, we'll trim, and then we will flip this fabric. So basically, we're replacing these corners really easily by stitching, cutting, and flipping squares of fabric. But I want to show you how to make sure you know which direction these squares are going to be going once you stitch and flip them, so that you don't have 2 different directions going on like I do in this block. You'll need a ruler, and you can use any kind of ruler to do this. So the first thing to make sure it's all the same direction is to lay it all out in the direction that you want it. So make sure your fish are in the same direction and you don't have one upside down and one in the other direction. And then make sure your herringbones are in the same direction as well, or whatever fabric you are using. I like to put them like this, right side up, and then say, okay, this is the direction I want it to be. So we can put them all on here to get ready to draw. These 2 are going to overlap, and these 2 are going to overlap a little bit as well, so that we have that 1/4-inch seam allowance so that the points go great on that tail. But we can look at this and say, okay, these are all the correct direction. So now you can either look at the paper that shows you how to put the blocks together, but we're going to use my block I already did as a reference and say, okay, so this block gets sewn at this angle. So it's going to sew from here to here. So I'm just going to grab one of the corners where I want the line. I'm going to turn it over, and then I'm just going to draw a line corner to corner. And I'm using a heat erasable pen so that you can see it. And then just to test, I'm going to put it down, right sides together, and I'll fold it where that would be stitched and make sure this is all going in the same direction. Okay, so that one is done. This one is going to be sewn this way. So I'm going to grab one of the corners and draw that line. And so I'm just going to use that same process, just checking each one for the directionality before I draw the line to stitch and flip. Now, if you do not care about directionality and you just want it to kind of be a surprise, you could just turn all these blocks over and draw the diagonal lines. And you'll probably end up with a block like mine, where some are going one direction and some are going the other direction. We're also going to need to pay attention to how we sew them together. So we'll be double checking again before we stitch them onto this block, because I really just want this one to be consistent. We can sew all of these on, and then we can trim and flip them, and then we can sew these on. We can't sew all of them at the same time, because if you sew this one first, you're not going to be able to trim and flip this one properly. So this one has to be trimmed and flipped before we sew this one on, because see how that is going to overlap. And we'll take these to the sewing machine and get stitching. So now we are just going to line these corners up and make sure they are in the correct direction. Make sure these 2 edges are lined up, and then we are going to sew on the line that we just drew. And whenever I'm doing quilting pieces like this, I use a smaller stitch between 1.8 and 2.0. And I'm going to daisy chain this where I can, which basically means instead of stopping, cutting, picking it up, and having to start the thread again, I'm just going to get my next piece ready, and I'm going to put it right under that foot and sew in a chain. So there'll just be like 3 stitches of thread in between these pieces. Then I can cut the back one off, and then we can do this corner as well. You never want to fold fabric and try and sew from there. That doesn't work out. So we had to cut and pick up our thread again on this one. Now we have these 3 corners on this piece and 1 on the tail. Now you could take this back to your cutting board and use wherever your workspace is, and use a rotary cutter to cut a 1/4 inch from the stitching. But because they're so small, I just grab larger scissors and I just cut them by hand. So I can just stay right here at my sewing machine. See, so I just cut a 1/4 inch from that stitch line. I'm going to do that on these other 3 pieces. And now we are going to go to the iron and do the flip part before we come back and do more stitching. Now, a lot of times I will use a wool pressing mat or just my ironing board, but I wanted to show you how I like to use this sometimes when I am pressing quilt blocks. This is the Quilter's Cut and Press from June Taylor, and it has the pressing, so it's got some cushion on the one side, and it is a rotary cutting board on the other side. This would be great if you're traveling or going to an event or going to quilt with a friend. But I like it because it has the grid line on the ironing surface, so it helps you to make sure you're ironing things straight. I'm also going to be using my little Cricut mini press. It's more for crafting because it's from Cricut, but it's just basically a very small iron. I really like it when I'm doing small pieces like this because I can really see and control what I'm doing better than with a large iron, and it also throws off less heat. The other tool I'm going to be using is a quilter's clapper, which, if you haven't heard me talk about it before, is a piece of wood. It is unfinished. It's got grooves in the side, so it's really easy and comfortable to hold. First, we're going to set the seam, which means we're not going to open it. We're just going to heat the seam, and we're going to press down with the quilter's clapper. They also make a tailor's clapper that's a little bit longer. The wood is going to absorb the heat and help flatten those stitches. Now, that might seem like ridiculous if you're new to quilting, like, really, is the stitch going to take up that much space? But there is a little bit of up and down, so we want everything as flat and consistent as possible. So this is just a good habit to get into setting your seams. And also, if you've used a heat erasable ink, it's going to get rid of it before you turn those corners. So if you recall, this used to be a rectangle. We cut all the corners off. So now we're going to do the flip part of the stitch and flip, and we are going to push that forward and basically recreate that rectangle. Press that. Now, this is where these lines can come in handy, especially when you get to multiple parts of a block. You can see if you are getting it straight. So I'm lining the fabric up along these lines, and now I'm pushing that forward, and it helps me see if I got that sewn on there well. I didn't sew perfect because this part is a little short. I'm not going to worry about it for this, but if you were doing a bigger block, more complicated, you would want to redo that section. But for demonstration purposes, I'm not going to worry about it. But see how this one is perfect. This is lined up perfectly. This is lined up perfectly. This one, not quite as much, so it's a bit off. Let's see how we did on this one. I did a good job on this one. So now that's a rectangle again. That's mostly a rectangle, slightly off there. So we have 2 more to do. I'm going to put this down. We have to put this one, and let's just flip it and make sure, yep, it's all going to go in the same direction. And then this one, when it flips, it's all going to go in the same direction. Okay, so now we just need to do the same process: stitch, trim, press, and flip. Now, just to show you the other way of doing this, if you didn't want to cut it with scissors, you can bring it over to your mat. You're going to put the stitch line a 1/4 inch in from your ruler. And one thing I love about these rulers is that blue line is exactly a 1/4 inch. So it's really easy to place and see. And then you're just going to trim that corner off. So same result, different tools. So we're going to set the stitches, and then we are going to flip and press. Now I'm going to look at my sample, or you can look at your diagram, and we're going to make sure we put this together correctly. So you're going to put these 2 together. We're going to be matching these 2 points. And we're going to sew here with a 1/4 inch seam. Matching these 2 points, you can pin or clip. I'm just going to clip that. And then you're just going to line up this edge, but also make sure that these sides are lining up. And if you fold that back and everything is going correctly, these 2 seams should be lined up as well on the top and on the bottom. I got that lined up. The bottom is lined up. The top is lined up. So let's go press it and look at our fish. One tricky part with this block is because you have 2 points coming together, you have a lot of bulk here. Look at this. You have 2 pieces angled in here, 2 pieces coming over here. It's very, very thick. So we're going to start by really setting that seam. For this one, I pressed it all to one side and got it flat. So let's try this one the opposite way. Let's try opening it up. So half of the bulk goes this way and half goes this way. Now, because it is so bulky, you can see it, how it's really popping up. I'm just going to spritz it with a little bit of water, get it wet. And then as we press that seam, it's going to dry the water. And I believe that is going to make that sit flatter than if we had just tried to press it when it was dry. Pretty flat. Now let's look at this on the grid and see how we did. Did pretty good. This one could stand to be redone. I'm just going to go through and cut off some of these extra little pieces. So now we have our fish. If you're going to use this for the Week at the Lake free quilt, you just need to make a bunch of these. If you just like the fish and you want to do something else with fish, you can add borders and turn it into whatever size block you want. So this is an 8.5-inch block. And if you wanted to, you could turn this one into an 8.5-inch block, but maybe have this fish sit up higher and then the next one lower. So instead of looking like a line of fish, it looks more like a school of fish because they're at different levels. So lots of different things you can do. But that is how easy it is to make a fish just by doing stitch and flip 6 times on 2 pieces of fabric and sewing them together. If you haven't done that before, you learned a new technique that you're going to see in a lot of different quilt blocks, and you also learned how to make a super cute fish. Happy sewing and happy quilting.